you don't know anything. Like literally, if you dig into what the licenses say, it's actually quite surprising where the licenses literally say, if I break things on purpose on your computer, that is in using the software, you waive me of all liability and responsibility. Now, whether that would stand up in court if you actually did that on purpose remains to be seen. But like that is what the licenses state.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of The Bug Mind. Today, since it's Maintainers Month, since it's Mental Health Awareness Month, we're doing a special episode with Mike McQuaid. Me and him are going to talk about our strategies on how to be an open source maintainers and still keep your mental health. So it's going to be a very interesting episode. Mike has a lot of experience and a lot of insights, so I really hope that you will enjoy it. I'll see you at the end. Hey Mike, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you're here. It's like you're literally one of my personal heroes when it comes to open source. So I'm super grateful that you decided to do this with me. And before we dive into deep, because I'm already so excited, can you tell us a bit more about like what you do in tech, like for someone that doesn't know who you are, which probably are very few people, but just for them, for my mom, probably.
Sure thing. So I guess I'll maybe start with what I'm doing right now and then work backwards. So right now I am CTO and co-founder of a startup called Workbrew, who is doing kind of commercialization in the homebrew space. What our product offering is right now is like providing MDM support, commercial enterprise level like support and general kind of features that kind of big companies need around using homebrew. If you know what homebrew is already, then great. If you don't, it's an open source package manager for predominantly Mac OS, but also for Linux. I've worked on homebrew for 15 years. I'm the project leader, which means, I guess, kind of tech lead and figurehead in some ways, but it's also an elected position. And I am also, I guess, have worked as a maintainer doing bits and pieces on homebrew for that entire time. And homebrew was 15 earlier this week. So it's a nice little celebration for
Happy birthday, homebrew.
Yeah, happy birthday to homebrew. So before I was working at Workbrew, I worked at GitHub for 10 years, where I left as a principal engineer. I worked on all sorts of things, like I built the archiving repos feature. That was my kind of idea. And then the like GitHub sponsors, worked on that, the merge queue, all sorts of like little bits and pieces over the years. Before that, worked at a few other kind of random startups and companies and stuff, and did the kind of, I guess most stereotypical / traditional route into tech of doing a computer science and business degree back in the day.
Awesome. And, you mentioned being an open source maintainer, and this is what we want to talk about today. We're both open source maintainers. This month is May, as you were saying earlier, and it's both Mental Health Month, Mental Health Awareness Month, and GitHub's Maintainers Month. So it felt like a nice coincidence to have these 2 months collide and have the two of us talking about, not only our experience in open source, but also like the mental health aspect of it. Because I think that open source maintainers in particular, like they're very prone to burnout. They're very prone to isolation. And, I think we've both had our fair share of experiences that have been stressful or, challenging. And I would love for people to basically, learn from our experience and create for themselves maybe an healthier approach towards open source. And, that's actually where I wanted to start about. So let's say you would start today doing open source, right? With your previous experiences, but like everything else is like the real world doesn't know about it. You're kind of like reincarnated in a younger version of you. Like, how would you set up your relationship to open source?
That's a great question. I think the main thing I would say is boundaries. So the boundaries are kind of all over the place. So some of it's boundaries with myself, some of it's boundaries with other people, some of it's boundaries with work, all that type of thing. But I guess I might spell out some specifics of what that might look like. So nowadays, what I have is all my homebrew GitHub notifications, for example, go to a separate email account, which is, my mike@brew.sh address. And what that means for me is I can check them separately. I can add or remove them to my phone. I can add or remove them to any computer or device separately. I can log in, I can log out. And I have that separation between what's going on in my kind of day to day, what's going on in my work, and what's going on in Homebrew stuff. So for example, I don't have Homebrew emails on my phone. Similarly with Slack, Homebrew has a Slack for maintainers to talk with each other. I don't have that on my phone either, unless I'm going on like a trip where I'm with Homebrew maintainers all the time and all that type of stuff. So basically, what this ends up meaning is I can be a lot more intentional about the time I spend and when I'm almost like ready for that energy in my life and thinking about Homebrew stuff, getting involved with Homebrew stuff, replying to Homebrew stuff. And in my case, it's kind of in more of a leadership role nowadays than I necessarily always have been. It also gives other people space to be like, if someone's like, oh, this is on fire, then it's not like Mike jumps in straight away and fixes it. You know, sometimes depending on when you ask, depending on the week, it may be if you ask that at 5:31 p.m. on a Friday, then Mike is not going to respond until 8:30 a.m. or later on a Monday, even on like almost like a normal working week, because I want to spend my weekend with my wife and kids and all that type of stuff.
Oh, that's awesome. And I think it's a very strong strategy, like creating this separation. It's basically the same. I do a similar thing for React Native. Basically, I'm even in a way more extreme when it comes to email. Like I literally have disabled GitHub sending me emails of any shape or form. So in that sense, like what I do is I'm very intentional, like subscribing to certain issues, subscribing to certain repositories, and like I only interact with GitHub when I'm on GitHub. So there is that, step of intentionality that you create, like, oh, I'm not passively receiving everything constantly, but I'm like, okay, if now I have time to, spend an hour looking at through GitHub notifications and replying to people, I'm going to open GitHub, and that's the time where I'm going to do that, right? So I think that's super important in general. And it's also in the broader mental health community, there's these like the theory of the spoons in a way. Have you heard of it?
Yep.
Yeah, it's basically that, right? You have a certain set of spoons that you can use every day for your tasks. So acknowledging yourself, you're like, okay, today I have only 3 spoons, today I have 7 spoons, like knowing like that your battery has a limit, and be like, okay, being intentional, I'm gonna use 2 spoons for GitHub today. I think it's one of the, it's a very healthy strategy, I find. And why do you think is necessary? Like kind of like, flipping the question on its head, like what's going on in open source for maybe someone that is not as involved with us, like that, you kind of need to create this healthier relationship?
Yeah. So I think it's, for me, again, like my patterns with open source have somewhat mirrored my patterns with work. They've been maybe slightly kind of time lagged compared to my patterns with work. But, when I was young and enthusiastic and working for a kind of work more hours startup, which is not, I work hard right now on my startup, but I'm not working as many hours as I did when I was 25 because I have other commitments. But there was that sense of almost like being switched on and being engaged 24/7 and being responsive 24/7, and that being a desirable thing that resulted in better quality software and, more whatever, like for employees or employers or whatever. Whereas I think I realized on the work side first that like I actually think that results in the long term, like worse software, worse teams, worse happiness for everyone involved compared to if you separate things. And I like that one you used before, intentionality. I feel like that's a really big thing where it's just important to kind of think about when you're spending that time and energy. So for me, from, a relatively early stage at GitHub, when I worked there, I'm based in Scotland, and most of my coworkers, most of the time I was at GitHub, were in the US. So what would happen is if I just had Slack on my phone, then my evening would just be ping, 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 ping. Right. So Slack was the first to go. And then particularly because once I was on call rotations, it's like, well, if someone really needs me, they can page me. Right. So if it's critical, I'll do it that way. And then, email went similarly, that I didn't put work email on my phone unless I was on a work trip or whatever. And frankly, I just like wanted the distraction because I was away from my family and stuff. But open source kind of maybe took a little bit longer for me to internalize the same attitudes. But I do actually think in lots of ways, frankly, almost everyone would be better probably making open source a bit more like work. I mean, for some people, maybe yourself, Lorenzo, I'm actually not sure right now, like React Native is maybe a big part of or your primary day job purpose, right? If you're an open source person in that situation, I think you should treat it 100% as work, right? And evenings and weekends and holidays and whatever, you should entirely disconnect, as most people would agree would be sensible for work. I think people find that harder when they're doing open source because there's less of an expectation there. But I think even if you're a volunteer or a hobbyist, I think it's still valuable to almost be like, right, I work on this, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, or whatever it may be, right? And I appreciate that's harder for people whose employers maybe say, right, you cannot spend even 2 minutes on open source during your workday. But again, in my case, I probably had at most a couple of years at GitHub where it was deemed officially acceptable for me to spend any time on Homebrew. And I probably had a couple of months every 3 or 4 years where I worked on a Homebrew related project. But the rest of that time, it was like, essentially, as long as I'm getting my work done, no one cares. But equally, if they were aware quite how much time I spent on Homebrew during working hours, someone would probably be like, hey, like, that's too much. But I got my work done. I got good performance reviews. So ultimately, that's not their problem. And it's easier for me to balance things that way. Things are a bit more blurred now because I'm doing a startup that is directly attached to Homebrew, which involves, sometimes building Homebrew features for my day job, effectively.
Yeah.
But even before that, like even in GitHub, I was probably doing the majority of my Homebrew stuff is like within working hours in a working capacity. And I also even think like open source, again, in terms of boundaries, like open source interpersonal relationships can sometimes be quite, I guess, non-work, like, either work in appropriate conversation, either people speaking to each other in a way that would get one of them fired in a workplace, like people being unreasonable, unwilling and unable to do things that would be a very basic expectation of a junior engineer in a workspace, a workplace even. I think all of this stuff, it has its place, and for some people, sometimes it makes open source better, but I'm not convinced that actually, certainly if you're a project at like Homebrew's level of scale, I think indulging people who want to behave in a way that would get them almost instantly fired in most workplaces is not a good idea, right? You shouldn't. People have the freedom to decide when to show up, what to do, what not to do on an open source project. I'm the leader of Homebrew, but I can't make anyone do anything on the project. I can sort of stop people doing things, but I can't make people do things. And to me, like that's the side that makes it better and more enjoyable than work. Like it shouldn't be that we're like, oh, well, we can all do whatever and behave in kind of very weird, inappropriate ways. Not saying this is the case in Homebrew, but there has been some isolated cases in the past where there has been that. And it's taken me too long to be like, hey, actually, you know what? Like this wouldn't be acceptable in a workplace. It's not acceptable here. Like change it or move on.
Yeah. There's so much to unpack in what you just said. I think I want to try to separate a few threads.
Please.
So first off, yes, at the moment, I think that like your current role and my current role at Microsoft mirror each other quite well in the sense that the project that we help maintain in the open source and that it started as something separate from work has become an intrinsic part of our work. And if I were to give someone as a suggestion, I would say that's probably one of the healthier ways to approach open source that you were saying, because at that point it's like, okay, this is work. When I'm not working, I'm not connected to that. And that feeds into the second thing that you kind of like mentioned, which is like open source by its inherent nature, it's kind of like on 24/7. When you're maybe, you're in Scotland, it means that maybe during the time you're sleeping, someone is using Homebrew in some other parts of the world and they're opening an issue and maybe it's something urgent and important for them. But you're, in Scotland, you're sleeping, it's the middle of the night. So having this aspect of the open source being always up, always running, always someone doing something, I think that that's like one of the traps that a lot of people fall into, because they're like, well, I just received this email. It's like, 11 p.m., but this person really needs my help. Sometimes people just like feel this overwhelming sense of responsibility, which is where like, having boundaries, I think is very important. And kind of going down this route for a second, and mentioning what is probably like the most impactful blog post I've read in many years. I wanted to touch a second on, one of the articles you wrote, I think in 2017 or even earlier than that, which was called Maintainers Owe You Nothing. Like, to quickly give a backstory, I was just starting out as a maintainer. I was like, 2017, around then. And basically, it wasn't part of my daily job. So I was doing it on the side. And I was doing it a lot, like many, many hours every weekend. And in less than 3 months, I basically burned out. And then I found your blog post that basically says, well, like it's open source, an open source project, all have a license. And this license says the software is provided as is, without warranty, guarantees, et cetera, et cetera. And, you, through that blog post explaining that that's kind of the contract that you create with your consumers, like that should set your expectations for yourself and also for your community to kind of like, if you use it, it's not my responsibility how it goes. And yeah, I don't know. I still think that that's one of the most important things that all the maintainers should learn. Let's start from the beginning. How did you decide to write that? What motivated you to go there?
I can't quite remember. I think it was, obviously I'd been involved with Homebrew for a while at that point, and I'd had a bunch of conversations with maintainers kind of over the years, and I realized that I guess at this point I'd been working on Homebrew for 5+ years, and in contrast to many of the people around me in Homebrew and many other projects, I had never burned out, right? Like I'd never, both in the perspective of like, and I still say that today. Like I've had 15 years, I've never burned out from Homebrew. Have there been times when Homebrew has been more enjoyable and less enjoyable? For sure. But probably in 15 years, I don't think there has been a month in which I've not done something related to Homebrew in that time. And also but the thing is, I've not felt the obligation either to do that. Like I've done it and I've continued to do it, and I continue to do it because I want to and because I enjoy it. And also interesting, I didn't realize this at the time, but if you Google my name, you find my website and stuff like that. But if you Google Mike McQuaid asshole, you will find various people on mainly Reddit, I think. But I think there's a couple of people in Hacker News.
It's Reddit. Who cares about Reddit?
Oh no, exactly. Well, I think there's an important point in that though, because I think what is interesting is that what you need to set yourself up for expectations wise, and this is a good maybe lesson for life, not just open source, is that if you have healthy boundaries and if you are doing things like, as I say, want to be an open source maintainer working on the same project for 15 years and not get burned out, some people are not going to like that, right? Some people are going to call you an asshole. Some people are going to call you selfish. Some people are going to call you the one who's entitled or lazy or a bad engineer or whatever it may be, right? But the thing is that those two things go together, right? And if you are chasing people's praise, then you are going to be the one who, as you say, is answering the email at 11 o'clock at night, the issue, this person desperately needs my help. I need to drop everything and help them because I owe this person stuff. It's like, actually, you don't, right? Like, as the blog post goes into the details of, and as open source licenses state, you don't owe anyone anything. Like, literally, if you dig into what the licenses say, it's actually quite surprising, where the licenses literally say, if I break things on purpose on your computer, that is, in using the software, you waive me of all liability and responsibility. Now, whether that would stand up in court if you actually did that on purpose remains to be seen. But like, that is what the licenses state. The licenses state, like if you want to use this software, you agree to all these terms in using the software, right? So if you don't like it, that's fine. And now you can't use it, right? So I think there's the letter of the law with this stuff. And then there's like the popular conception, which is like, well, actually, and even in responses to this blog post I've seen, people are like, well, okay, well, technically open source maintainers don't owe you anything, but like, really they should, if there's an urgent thing that needs fixed, like they should fix that because they put this out into the world and they have that degree of responsibility. And I reject that. Like, I don't think that applies to people who are volunteers. By all means, hold billion-dollar corporations to that standard. By all means, hold companies that you're paying and have a support contract with to that standard. But some random person who has received either none or through GitHub sponsors, probably like, 100x below market rate level compensation for their open source work, that person owes you nothing. And you are, particularly if you're a large organization or corporation, if you expect that person to jump when you need them to, like, you're actually very foolish, right? Like, and you are being very irresponsible and silly to put the back of your organization on the back of that one individual. So I think that's where it came from, basically. That the blog post, it felt like something that I had internalized quite a while before, and a lot of people needed to hear. And as I sort of predicted when I wrote it, like, a lot of maintainers really liked it, resonated with them heavily. I've got a lot of public and private feedback, and I still see random people posting it and sending it to other maintainers on Twitter or Mastodon or whatever to this day. And an awful lot of open source users who have never been a maintainer find it incredibly offensive. And I think the thing is, I don't think you could do it without. I don't think you could do one of those things without the other, basically.
Yeah, I guess in a way it created this polarization because some people have a perception that open source is supposed to be something, and if someone tells them, okay, here's the line, they're like, well, that's not my line, so they kind of like get offended. And I think that I'm so happy, by the way, to hear that you never had a burnout. I had 1.5. Like, the first one was before I found out your blog post. The second one was kind of like for work-related reasons back then. But I think that it's very unique in a sense, like how your ability to create these boundaries allowed you to survive this long in a way. Literally, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a maintainer that like out of the blue, like literally archived their projects because they received an email that was absolutely like vile. Like, it was just like full of insults and everything. And what they did was, name and shame. They literally screenshotted the email and put it in the README, like, well, the project is not being maintained anymore because of this. And especially now, not only this type of behavior sadly still exists in open source, and we should call it out as something that people should not do. Let's be clear, people should not behave like that in open source. Like, you're not entitled to anything. But also, we've learned that, for example, for the XZ attack, basically what happened was that the actor basically social engineered to get the maintainer, because they were in a vulnerable position, like a person working on their own, working on a side project. Like, they managed to basically, as far as I understood, like bully them out of the project. So if anything, right now, it's even more important that, what you stated in the blog post is like, basically we need all the open source maintainers to kind of like create those barriers in their mind, like create this level of like extra skin around their body to kind of like make sure that they don't get overwhelmed. Especially, like, you also brought up Reddit, and I still think that we're entering now a phase where people sometimes, I don't know if that's also your experience, but some people act in the GitHub issues, literally as if it was Reddit, like, and that's incredible to me. And you mentioned like the role of like being a lead in a big project, and like telling people, okay, if you behave this way, you're not welcome here. Open source projects have code of conducts and similar things. How do you think, does these things help in your experience with like how your community uses your project?
I think so. So for me, code of conducts have gone back and forth, I think. And I think my view is they're helpful, but not as helpful as people might think they are, and only helpful when they're not tokenistic, right? Like, so if you're just like, oh, well, GitHub tells me to add a code of conduct, so I'm going to add a code of conduct, and then you don't enforce it or even really read it, and you just use someone else's copy pasted thing that you don't really think about. I don't think that really achieves anything, right? Because you're not actually making it a better or safer space. We took a code of conduct, I think, from before it was that popular or widely done on GitHub repos. We were one of the kind of earlier projects to kind of have a code of conduct, and we avoided some of the kind of drama around whether code of conducts are good or bad, I think, as a result of that, because we were, we got in there before, and I think we based it off Python's maybe like in-person event code of conduct. But the big thing with us on code of conduct is it's like essentially we have a very, very low, again, things people don't like about Homebrew, things people don't like about me, we have a very low tolerance to banning people, particularly people who have never contributed to the project, right? Like if essentially my rule on almost any open source interaction, right, is if it's going south on Homebrew, is if I consider your behavior to be inappropriate, whether or not you agree or not, that's, in some ways irrelevant, right? Like if I consider your behavior to be inappropriate, I will publicly state on GitHub, providing I don't have any sort of private means of contacting you, which I normally don't. I will publicly state on GitHub, like essentially, this is out of order. Like, please read our code of conduct and adjust your behavior. 9 times out of 10, maybe 95 times out of 100, that person will then apologize, sometimes with a very bad apology, but like at least they're trying, right? They will apologize, they will adjust their behavior, and then we're fine moving forwards. The other proportion of the time, people get argumentative or defensive or say, no, actually, I don't have to behave that way, or actually, Mike McQuaid, your behavior is worse than my behavior, whatever. My experience has been, and it's up to people what they do on their different projects, as soon as things go that way, that is never recovered, right? Like a person who, when called out on bad behavior, and again, another open source to real world tip, if you have friends, family members, whatever, who, if you say, hey, you've upset me or hurt me or whatever, if their response is generally like anything other than sorry, and then they can go and say their piece afterwards, like then that's not great. But yeah, in open source, my response now is like if that person basically doubles down on their behavior or doesn't apologize and doesn't even try and do like a shitty, I'm sorry you feel that way.
I'm sorry you feel that. Exactly.
Yeah,
I was about to say
that's
the same thing.
Yeah, sorry you feel that way is like a bad apology, apology. Like sometimes people are actually trying to apologize. They just have never got very good at apologizing, right? And like, I take that as like, and then for me, I'm then like, okay, like, thank you for the apology. Let's move on. We're all good, right? Whereas the other people, I will almost certainly immediately ban them from the project. If they are someone for whom we haven't seen positive contributions or whatever before, they will get banned forever, basically straight away, right? And that means they can't submit issues, pull requests, discussion comments. Essentially, for the Homebrew organization on GitHub, they have no access to that ever again. And again, for me, this is the benefit of the code of conduct, because the code of conduct sets quite clear expectations on what behavior is inappropriate and inappropriate. And again, some people don't get even asked to apologize. So if you jump in with like an ethnic slur or like a sexist or transphobic slur or whatever, then like you just get banned straight away. There's not even a conversation there. There's no, particularly, as I say, if you're someone who we've had no interaction with before and you decided, yeah, my first contribution to the Homebrew issue tracker is going to be posting like garbage like that, then it's like, well, no, like fuck it. Like it's not even worth the emotional energy trying to deal with and fix those people. But in some way that leads me to like a wider point on this stuff, which is I think another funny thing with hierarchy in open source. And I do think it's good that there's a lot more encouragement than there used to be to try and get design resources, docs resources, whatever involved in projects, getting people contributing and stuff like that. But fundamentally, in a software project, maintainers who are working on code, they are the most important thing on that project. Because if they do not get involved, if all the maintainers who write all the code, review the PRs, do the releases, if they all go away or they stop replying to their notifications, that project is now dead. That project does not exist anymore. That software is now unmaintained. So at the end of the day, like actually, and again, the other funny opposite end of the spectrum is if you were a software company selling things to people for money or, selling people's eyeballs if you're an advertising funded company, your users are your customers and they're important to the success of your business. In open source, a user who never files an issue report that actually ends up, being a reproducible bug that is fixed for other people or whatever, never files a PR, whatever, they just use the software, they provide no value to the open source project, right? So with those people, the minute they are in a situation where they are ruining the day of maintainers and sapping the motivation of maintainers to work on that project, those people their communication needs to be stopped immediately. Because those people actually, and I'm not exaggerating, those are the people who are at the biggest risk of killing open source software, are entitled people who are rude and who make maintainers be like, I guess the 11 o'clock email example, right? Like there might be a maintainer who's spending their evening having a great time working on some code and an issue comes in and then they're just like, oh, fuck this. I don't want to spend the rest of my evening doing this. I'm going to go and have an early night or have a drink or watch some TV or whatever instead because this person has now just made my evening not fun. Like that time that maintainer would have spent has been stolen by the person being rude or entitled or horrible or whatever. So like those people have no value in open source and we should just silence them as quickly and as effectively as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that maybe, it's more likely that the people listening to this are also like not maintainers. So just to explain it to them, I think, I don't know about you, but I think at some point you kind of like get quite adjusted to recognizing how someone is communicating and figuring out, okay, this is probably a person that wants to still be helpful. They just have, a bit of a more direct style of communication, and instead like recognizing that versus someone that is actually just trying to be provocative, toxic, or as you were saying, like detrimental to the project. So, and not just that, the GitHub interface will tell you like if this person has ever contributed to your project.
Exactly.
And if you worked on a project for a long time, sometimes you start recognizing the usernames and the avatars. So, I'm not saying you should fear the maintainers, but like don't think the maintainers are stupid. That's I guess what I wanted to say. It's just like they are humans. Yeah.
Given your caveat that most people listening to this are not open source maintainers themselves, I guess the two things I would state there is one, as I mentioned before, when I talk about like silencing these people or whatever as quickly as possible, I mean the people who, when they're asked to apologize, do not apologize, right? If your communication is, I have very direct communication style, and if someone is like, Mike, you're being a dick or whatever, then I will almost always be like, I'm sorry, like, I'm sorry, and then try and adjust my behavior and communication going forward. So like, and the second thing is, like a lot of things in life, right? Like I heard a good line a while ago, like, if you're worrying about whether or not you're a good parent, you're probably a good parent because, the bad parents are the ones who are not worrying about whether or not they're good, right? It's the same thing where if you heard what I said before and you're like, oh no, maybe I'm this person, maybe I'm the one who's like a toxic open source contributor, I never realized till now, you're not, right? Like the people who are like that, because I've had the misfortune sometimes to meet a couple of them in person, like they are completely oblivious and completely convinced that they are in the right and the open source projects are in the wrong, right? So if you have that, if you heard me say this before and you're now getting a nagging sense of like, oh, that's me, it's not you. I'm not talking about you. Like I'm talking about the people who will hear this and think that's definitely not me.
Yeah, and also like to kind of like hammer down, like if you're worried about this, you're probably not one of them. I think after a certain point, you also recognize when English is not their first language. Maybe for me, it's also easier because I'm also a person that doesn't have English as first language. So at some point, you recognize if someone is inadvertently being, abrasive, just because maybe what they did was literally put in Google Translate their phrase, copy pasted it, and Translate just went for it. It's that bit of the second interactions where it's really telling if there's intentionality. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, okay, so we've talked about the bad aspect of the community, and how that can really weigh down on a maintainer and like literally destroy their mental health, especially if they don't have, these good level of separation and boundaries. Maybe, just to kind of like lift the spirits a bit, like how do you see the role of the community around an open source project? You mentioned, that the software engineers, the people who are actually working on the project themselves are very important people because they are the ones bringing the project forward. Like, in React Native, I've seen like how the power of the community and creating a good community, an healthy community around the project is really what, maximizes the impact and, the success of the project. So what do you think about that? How do you find that your relationship with the community works?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard like there's been a bunch of successful communities I've been part of, some open source, some not. But like one of the rules that I think is nicest with like, if you want to be a good member of a community, or if you want to have a community mainly full of good people, it's you should be aiming to help others as much, if not ideally more, than you are yourself being helped. If you are just the only time you ever interact with Homebrew issue tracker is to ask a question and then your question gets answered, then you never do anything ever again. Like that's fine. But that's not, I'm not saying like that's terrible, but I'm saying if you have a community that is entirely of that nature, then like that is not great. And even on that, if you ask a question and you get help and, even just stuff like saying, thank you, Homebrew's great, you rock. Like those messages are surprisingly rare. And if someone just shows a bit of gratitude, then it's the opposite of what I said before of like, ruining maintainer's evening. Like sometimes that can sort of make a maintainer's day of being like, oh, great, this person was really nice and helpful. But that's the thing is I've talked, it's a little bit like maybe of a random tangent, but like I've talked before and I wrote a blog post about this thing I call the mentorship diamond, where, when I was principal engineer at GitHub, like a increasing proportion of my job as I got promoted was doing mentorship, right? And not just mentoring, but like mentoring other people on how to mentor and all this type of stuff. And the idea of like the diamond is that like every person has, and in some ways I stole this from when I used to be religious. I forget the religious version, but essentially like every person should ideally have like people above them that you can receive mentorship from, people below them that you can give mentorship to, and then peers who you can almost like sort of have a kind of mutual kind of mentor-mentee relationship depending on what you're talking about, or like support each other and whatever, right? And I think the same thing goes for open source. It's like if you've used Homebrew for a year, say, right, and you've never had any issues, you never had any problems on the issue tracker, there's still probably questions that people ask in the Homebrew discussion forum that you could answer, right? So I think the community is getting the idea that like no one is not knowledgeable enough to help, and it's about motivation and time investment and how much do you want to do stuff. Because again, like a relatively common practice that we have in Homebrew is like we have essentially like 3 types of issues that maybe get opened. So one might be like, yeah, we should definitely do this. One of the maintainers is probably going to jump on this, and whether it's a bug or a feature or whatever, like, yeah, like essentially great idea. Someone will do this, like, well done. And then at the other end, we have a like, no one is going to do this, right? Even if someone makes a perfect pull request for this, we do not want Homebrew to do this thing. And then there's the middle ground, which is in some ways the most interesting, where we're like, none of the maintainers are probably going to do this right now. But if you want to do this, then we will accept this, right? Like we would accept that functionality. And again, that's when I think the community stuff gets more interesting, because like we try and essentially then we're sort of doing a bit of a nudge to be like, hey, like you're a user, you want a thing, like nudge, nudge, you too could become a contributor. And that's when often people say, oh, well, I've never written any Ruby before, so I couldn't possibly do any of this. And my response is often like, I hadn't written any Ruby before I started contributing to Homebrew, and now I've been doing it professionally for 15 years, and I speak at Ruby conferences and whatever, right? Like it's one of those things where like your willingness to kind of like walk that way goes a very long way. And also like even your willingness to kind of open a PR that's completely broken, but like at least you've tried, and then maintainers will get involved and help you out and all that type of thing. So I think that's what I see with almost like the community side, is that I want to see like people trying to help, and then that in turn attracts help from others, and like people get together and do that. Whereas when people are being more extractive, they just want to get out their problem being solved, and then they're going to go away and never talk to you ever again. Like that's fine. Like that happens. That's probably even the majority of people in the community, and that's okay. But like that's not really what we want to be encouraging or rewarding, and that's not really the top of my priorities to kind of help those type of people, basically.
Yeah, you to talk to our audience, like, don't be the person that open an issue saying that they have a problem, and then a week later write a comment, oh, never mind, solved, and don't explain how you solved it.
Yeah.
Like that's the bare minimum. Like you at least want to contribute that small piece back of like, hey, I fixed this way,
Yep.
And I get a lot of people asking me like how they can get started in open source, and how to become a maintainer, how to be part of a project. And as you were just saying, like it's just about showing up, being willing to collaborate with others, and don't be scared to try things out that you never tried yourself. Like your project, even React Native is like is inherent nature. It's JavaScript, Kotlin, Java, Objective C, Swift. Like there's the layer, and then there are all these layers below. So it's like 7 or 8 technologies that are just working in a massive concert. Like there's no way someone knows all of them. So you cannot expect like, oh, if I want to become a maintainer of that project, I need to be good in everything. It's like no one, even of the existing maintainers, is that good. So yeah, talking about that and kind of like going back to you in a way, like you mentioned, you've been doing it for 15 years. You've been doing it because you like what you do. Like if you had to, I guess, explain how motivation works for you, how does that look like? Like how can you do something for 15 years? I find that for me, thinking to do something for 15 years is incredibly exhausting. Like how do you find that motivation?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say that it's, aside from my marriage and some of my closest friendships, it's I haven't done anything for 15 years as long as Homebrew in my life other than that, right? But I think for me, it's, I don't know. Again, like maybe my marriage is a kind of a good example. Like without getting into too many details, we met when we were both young and whatever, and it wasn't one of these things where we were like, where when we started going out, like, oh, we're gonna get like instantly like we're gonna get married and have kids and whatever. It was just like, I like this person, they like me, we have a good time, and we kept having a good time. And, in my case, over 20 years later, we're still having a good time, right? And it's kind of the same thing with Homebrew with me in some ways, where it's like I just started getting involved because I was like, I need this tool to do some stuff it doesn't currently do, and I want to do it. And doing that is fun, right? So doing Homebrew stuff is still fun. I still find it engages me in a way that is enjoyable. And particularly when I have had kind of day jobs in the past, like there's a refreshing, I find like my Homebrew contributions have been balanced out by essentially like how much autonomy I have in whatever day job I'm doing, right? Like how much control I have over what I'm doing when I'm working, like how I write my code, whatever. Because in open source, you have like at the absolute minimum, like a lot more autonomy generally than a typical day job. Yeah. And I think that's the thing for me is just, I mean, every time I sit down and do Homebrew stuff, it's, if someone was to literally say like, why are you doing this? I'd be like, well, because Homebrew's fun. And if it, is it frustrating sometimes when I can't get a bloody test to pass? Yes, of course. But like, it's still kind of worth it overall in like kind of bigger picture thing. And I think, and I don't know, like, I guess it's funny, I'm still like a big gamer. I play, a reasonable amount of computer games and stuff like that. Nice. But like, it's funny because there's certain games that just like, they hit my brain in the same way as like a friend got me into, I think it was like Factorio or something like that. One of these Factorio, like, yeah, like kind of logic-y based ones. And it's funny because eventually they like hit my brain in a way that I was like, oh, this is like the same as programming, right? But the difference is like in a funny way for me, it's actually like not nice because I'm like, this is just the same amount of fun, no more or no less than Homebrew. But when I do Homebrew, particularly nowadays, it's like literally millions of people benefit from the stuff I do, right? So It's like when it's fun for me and it's beneficial to lots of people, then that's a kind of a nice sweet spot. And again, I mentioned before all the haters and stuff like that. It's like at the end of the day, like, I wouldn't say I'm an arrogant guy, but I'm definitely a guy who's like has sufficient self-confidence. And like, when I get some person being like, oh, you should run your project this way, or like, you're terrible at this or whatever, it's like, well, I was principal engineer at GitHub. Like, I've been running the homebrew for a while. Homebrew's got quite a lot of users. Like, the thing I don't say, but I do think, is like, what have you done, right? And most of the time, the people who are the quickest to criticize, the answer is nothing. Like, they've not done anything of any real note or whatever, right? And that's fine. I'm not saying they should have done, but it is saying, like, I'm not going to let that person define my self-worth, right? Like, if John Carmack or someone who, some other person that I grew up, like, idolizing, right? If he was, like, met me at a conference and was like, oh, by the way, Mike, I've been following your career closely. Turns out you're actually a worthless piece of shit, right? Like, that would probably hit me a little bit harder, right? Even then, I still think I'd be like, well, actually, you know what? Like, I have a happy life, I'm balanced, whatever. But, like, I think that's the thing. I think it's, at the end of the day, I guess, the shorter answer to a lot of this stuff would be, most of my motivation for most of my stuff in my life is intrinsic. Like, I don't do it for external validation, or when my intrinsic motivation involves other people, it's knowing that other people are benefiting from what I'm doing, even if they don't say thank you to me. It's like every time I see someone type a homebrew command into a terminal, like, them typing that command, like, I hear a little,
Pling.
you're welcome, thank you, or like, and I have a little like mental, like, yeah, you're welcome. Nice. Like, and to some people that would seem maybe very, particularly British or Scottish people, like, that would seem maybe very arrogant or self-involved or whatever. But I think for me, it's like, that's how I get through it, right? So it's like, and again, to jump way back to what you were saying about burnout, it's like, at the end of the day, the best thing for you as an open source maintainer is to not get burnt out, right? Like, if you work on a project, particularly if you're a solo maintainer, right? Like, what your community and your users want is they want you to be around still doing this in 10 years, right? Like, and if you answering a issue at 11 p.m. makes, every time you do that, you're probably making it a little bit less likely that you're going to be around in a few years. Like, that's actually, they don't know that they don't want you to do that, but they actually kind of don't want you to do that, right? It's kind of self-defeating for their own interests, like them being like, this is very important and you need to not sleep enough tonight to fix this thing.
Yeah. There's, the short-term goals and the long-term sustainability of the project, in a way, at play when you take those decisions. And I loved your answer also because to kind of like reframe it in a certain way, like, there's, control over what you do. You see, a result out of your direct actions. And you also, and that's all like around a good core of, knowing yourself and being able to, you say, okay, this thing is outside of me. Like, even if John Carmack said to me that I'm not good at my thing, I can individually, like, by myself, identify the things that are good for my life and the things that I'm good at. And despite him, I would still have like this good core internally. And I think this is very important, and it's not like necessarily an innate skill, like being able to recognize why you like something, even having like this strong core internally to kind of like make sure you don't weave too much. Some time ago, you also wrote a blog post about therapy and finding a therapist. Is that something that helped with that? Do you think that? How would you help someone create this core and like this level of awareness and knowing your limits and knowing what works and doesn't work for you?
Yeah, I think therapy for me has been very helpful. Like, I started therapy for the first time during COVID, and yeah, I think it was just obviously that was a tough time for literally the majority of the world. But yeah, like I think it was something I found very helpful in kind of figuring stuff out. And also, like, for me, it was like having kids and being like aware. I'm not going to go into like details really here, but like, I had some aspects of my upbringing were pretty tough. And there's like pros and cons from that. Like one of the cons, which I wanted to address in therapy, is like, hey, like, how do I stop these? This is me using current therapeutic language. I wouldn't have put it this way at the beginning, but essentially, like, how do I stop myself using these kind of coping mechanisms that maybe in the past have been very helpful, but right now are not helping me, right? But the flip side of that is like, I have, as the result of kind of a difficult past, like essentially my life gets better every year, right? And has done pretty much since my school days. And for me, like I came into open source with probably almost certainly a dramatically thicker skin than average, right? Like I don't get, people have sent me some truly horrendous emails, and like I'm able to kind of, even before therapy, found myself able to laugh them off more often than not, because I'm just like, this person thinks like, essentially like this person thinks that they're going to really succeed in hurting me by saying this stuff. They don't know me. Like, I don't care. They're a moron, whatever. But I guess I have found therapy particularly useful in the last few years of identifying, like, what do I need? What should I be doing with my time? What should I have in my life? And it's something I've just found very, like, particularly as like life gets more full and stressful and difficult, it just really helps to have that space where I have someone kind of to talk to and figure out like what should I be doing, like what do I think, in a very like non-judgmental, like centered around my values rather than the other person kind of trying to project their values on me and stuff like that. And as you mentioned, the kind of blog post I wrote, like if anyone listening to this thinks, oh, like therapy is something that kind of I might try or is helpful, or I would say even more so if someone listening to this has had essentially anyone in their life who have done therapy be like, hey, by the way, it would probably be helpful for you, you'd probably benefit from doing therapy, then I'd strongly encourage you to investigate that. And the blog post I wrote was essentially, I stole it off some other people who told it to me, which was like a step-by-step guide of like, okay, I want to get a therapist. Like, how do I do that? Right. Like, and it's basically just like, here's where you go. Here's the things you select. Here's my recommend process of like speaking to a few people and whatever. And I've mentioned boundaries quite a few times in here. The other really nice thing with therapists is you can do stuff like almost like interview a few and get a feel of like, who do you gel the most with? And like therapists are generally like, boss level people when it comes to like personal boundaries. So like, don't worry about asking the therapist for something that you're like, oh, maybe they won't be okay with doing this, or maybe this is kind of taking advantage of them, whatever. Because my experience is that like, in general, like most therapists are the people who will not let you take advantage of them. Like they're exceptionally good at not doing stuff like that. So basically, like
almost as if it was their job.
Exactly. Something I'd very heavily recommend at least investigating if it's something you can do and afford and you have the resources to kind of find a therapist and get help and whatever. The bar for kind of how many issues you need to have or whatever is dramatically lower than you would probably think.
Yeah. You don't need like a big traumatic event to start therapy. Like you could just get started today. There's, well, also I also did write a blog post about finding a therapist, so you can read both of ours. But basically they said the same thing, it started. And to kind of like parroting back the questions you were saying at the start about, being a good parent. Like if you ask yourself if you need to go to therapy, you should probably go to therapy. There was one more thing I wanted to chat for a second about, but it went away from my mind, and I can feel the muscles in my face. I'm not used to smile and be positive and happy for this long, usually. So I can feel them like, why are these muscles all tense? You're not supposed to be smiling. So I think this is probably like around a good time where we can start to close this conversation. And to close it off, kind of, I usually ask everyone the same question. So Mike, if there was like one key learning that you would like, a person listening to our conversation, maybe an open source maintainer, maybe just someone that uses open source, like what's the one key learning they should take from you and like apply to their life?
I think for me, the key learning would be boundaries are really important and valuable. But, and I maybe didn't say this as directly before now, boundaries are also a thing that you have to be willing to enforce yourself. It's not enough to just tell other people your boundaries and then throw up your hands and be like, oh, they stepped all over my boundaries. No, it's your job to figure out not just what your boundaries are, but how you will respond if others do not respect those boundaries. And I guess the final piece is a really good person to figure out if you can't figure out what your boundaries are or should be, and you can't figure out how to enforce those boundaries in an appropriate fashion, then a therapist is a really good person to do that with. And I guess as a flip side, because it's not really been mentioned, stuff like Reddit is like, there's all these places on Reddit where you can ask for advice. Do not use Reddit to help inform your boundaries, because generally if you ask Reddit like, oh, like, this person I'm best friends with and have been for 20 years, him and I had a minor falling out, Reddit will tell you to like excommunicate that person, never speak to them ever again. So like, yeah, don't see a Reddit person, go see a real therapist, and that will probably be something that is helpful for you. Not everyone can afford a therapist, but if you're someone working in tech on a kind of tech worker salary, I'm not saying that like you necessarily have the money, but I think you probably, if you shuffle things around enough and you feel like it would be beneficial, you can probably find a way of affording it. And it's probably something that you will find will be well worth the money and very justifiable for you.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you, Mike. And to kind of close it off, and also because it came back to me, like, I think that if there's one fear rouged with all the things that Mike said and I said, is that you're really always the same person. You cannot, like, the boundaries doesn't mean that, oh, when I'm in work mode, I'm a work person, and when I'm in my personal life, I'm a personal life. The things between the two worlds will actually influence each other. So as we were saying earlier, the email at 11 p.m., like, that's your personal life. But if you get that work email, it will ruin your personal life evening, right? So that's why boundaries are important, and how you enforce them are important, because you really need to remember that you're just one person dealing with all these things all the time. So yeah, I think this is a great point to finish up. Mike, thank you so much again. This has been so great. I'm so grateful that you decided to do this with me. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me, Lorenzo. I've had a good time as well.
Thank you. Goodbye. And that was it. Thank you so much for sticking around till the end. Please like and subscribe, as always. This episode was a very special one to me. I absolutely adore Mike. So please show him some love around. All the links to all the things are going to be in the description, both for Mike, for the content we talked about. So I'll see you there. Take care.